Hello and welcome to another Ceasefire Moment. We're going to continue our study in Matthew 6 with fasting. We just finished up looking at alms, and then we looked at prayer, and now we're looking at fasting. In Matthew 6, it's a continuation of what we typically call the Beatitudes or the Sermon on the Mount. They don't end in Matthew 5, it continues in Matthew 6. He's speaking to his disciples. The disciples had followed him as he pulled himself away from all those people who had been walking with him and wanting healed. And he pulled himself away, and his disciples followed him, and he begins to teach them specifically. We want to try and put ourselves in a Jewish mindset because Jesus was raised in the Jewish culture, and they were living in the Jewish culture. All the disciples were not necessarily Jews. They were a mixture of people. But in general, the culture of where they were at was a Jewish culture. We're going to start in verse 16. And when you disciples are fasting, don't be like the hypocrites of sour countenance, for they disfigure their faces basically so that they can appear to men to be fasting. What he's saying here is that these people are fasting and they're disfiguring their faces and of sour countenance just so everyone around them will know that they're fasting. Verily I, Jesus, say to you disciples, that the hypocrites, they have their rewards. If you want to do things before men, to have men notice you, then that's your reward. You get your reward from men. But you disciples fasting, anoint your head and wash your face, that you disciples may not appear to men to be fasting, but to your Father who is in secret. And your Father who is seeing in secret will reward thee manifestly, which means openly. He's telling his disciples, you don't want to do things so that men can see you. You want to do things so that God can see you. It's about where your heart is and who you're trying to impress. That's the continuing theme here in Matthew 6. Is if you want to do things before men, and that's the whole purpose of why you're doing them, then you get your reward from the men. If you want to do things before God, you can do them in secret because he knows what happens in the secret, and then he will reward you openly. Now, there's some question as to what fasting actually means here. Originally, it was done during times when the heart was overwhelmed with an emotion, which causes you to just not want to eat or drink. I'm sure many of you have had times like that. You just didn't care if you ate or drank. You were so consumed in the emotions that you had, such as times of sorrow or times of great decision. And over time, it took on a spiritual purpose, expressing a sorrow over sin and guilt before God. Reformed Judaism has one God-mandated fasting day, which is the Day of Atonement, which we find in Leviticus and Numbers. In these scriptures, it references afflicting the soul, which was believed to imply fasting as a form of self-denial based on what was written in Isaiah 58, which we'll look at in just a moment. It is the only fast ordained in the Pentateuch, meaning it's the only one that God ordained, is to have a fasting day or to afflict your soul on the Day of Atonement. In the New Testament, the Day of Atonement is referred to as just simply the fast, and we find that in Acts 27. Fasting is also observed in scriptures in times of personal failure or sorrow, important decisions, conviction of sin, war or battle, sickness, death, and brokenheartedness. Generally, it's observed during times of sorrow or a down feeling. It wouldn't be observed during a time of joy. The sounding of the shofar is often performed in relation to fasting, and fasting with prayer and alms became a ritual that was seen as a way to atone for sins. And this is what we're looking at right now, where Jesus is addressing that specific problem. Fasting publicly became a practice where people would stand in the public areas and pray out in the open. They'd tear their clothes, wear sackcloths, and put ashes and earth on their heads. So it was definitely a public spectacle, and they were doing it on purpose in the public so that people would see them. And this is why Jesus is addressing this particular issue. In Isaiah 58, we're starting in verse 3, but it's actually the entirety of Isaiah 58. God talks about how what they're doing is unacceptable to him. They're seeking their own pleasure. They're oppressing their workers. They're quarreling, fighting, and hitting with fists. And they're asking God, we're fasting. Why don't you hear us? Basically, he's trying to say, I don't even recognize this as fasting. And then he goes on to say what fasting would look like to him. He says, an acceptable fast to me is a day for a person to be humble, to bow down his head, to spread sackcloth and ashes under him, loose the bonds of wickedness, undo the straps of the yoke. Let the oppressed go free. Share your bread with the hungry. I find it interesting. I'm just making a note that God says that on this day of affliction, that you would share your bread with the hungry. So does that mean you eat bread even if you're fasting? There isn't anywhere in the Bible where it actually says what you can eat or what you can't drink. Bring the homeless poor into your house. Cover the naked. Take away the yoke, the pointing of the finger, and speaking wickedness. Pour yourself out for the hungry. Satisfy the desire of the afflicted. Turn back from doing your pleasure on my holy day, the Sabbath. Call the Sabbath a delight and the holy day of the Lord honorable. And honor the Sabbath, not going your own way, seeking your own pleasures, or talking idly. So that is what is acceptable to God as far as a fast goes. What we find is that Jesus is saying that if you want to fast, but fast in secret, keep it something between you and God, and not to do it so that men would see it. If you happen to be fasting and people see you, that's not necessarily an issue. It's that, where is your heart in it? Is your heart so that people will see you, or is your heart so that God would see you? Since this is a shorter video, I thought I'd show you another tool that I found. It's a Bible visualization which cross-references whatever particular book you would pick from here to whatever you would pick from here. And you can see that I have Matthew picked on the left-hand side compared to the Old Testament. When you come down through here, you can see the different chapters. And if you see, chapter 5 is very heavily connected to the Old Testament, as is chapter 6. 1, 2, and 3 are as well. But you can get an idea of just how connected Matthew is to the Old Testament. If you want to look at, say, Leviticus, where we have all of our commandments are listed, you can see the connections tend to come from Matthew 5 and 6. You can also look in Exodus. Again, it's pretty heavy in Matthew 5 and 6 and in 26. And let's take a look at Numbers and maybe Deuteronomy. Again, pretty heavy up here in the beginning chapters, and Deuteronomy. And you can see how heavy it is. Jesus isn't telling us anything new. He's basically resetting things back to the way they should have been. They were basically following man-made laws instead of God-made laws. And Jesus is trying to bring everyone back to the basics and the foundations, which are found in how God designed things to work. That concludes this ceasefire moment. It's a short one. Hope you'll join us on the next one, where we'll cover the remainder of Matthew 6. Thank you for joining us for this ceasefire moment. We hope you've learned something.